Good morning. Governor Cooper has proclaimed June 2021 as LGBTQ Pride Month. LGBTQ Pride Month recognizes and celebrates the contributions of LGBTQ people make to our nation and society. And to support this proclamation, the Office of State Human Resources is pleased to have this virtual EEO Network Lunch and Learn event, Transforming Workplaces, Becoming More Trans, Non-Binary Inclusive, today. And we are pleased to have State Representative Stephanie Byers of Kansas as she addresses these topics and shares her views on how state employees can work to eliminate disparities and create a more welcoming, informed, and trans-inclusive work culture. You will be able to, you hopefully have been able to view Governor Cooper's proclamation, and for those people who were not able to view the presentation today, it will also be available via YouTube for on-demand viewing. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Please make sure that you keep your microphones on mute throughout the presentation today. And if you have any questions, please submit those questions to our chat. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker for this morning. Stephanie Byers is an American politician and educator. She was elected to the Kansas State House of Representatives from the 86th District in the 2020 general election, making her the first openly transgender person to serve in the Kansas legislature, and the first transgender Native American person elected to the office in America. She is a member of the Chickasaw Nation. Byers received her bachelor's degree and master's degree from Oklahoma Christian University and Kansas State University, respectively. She taught high school for 32 years before retiring in 2019. In 2018, she received the National Educator of the Year Award from GLSEN, formerly the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network. From 2018 to 2020, she served on the board of Wichita Pride, and during her tenure, she also served as the Communications Director and Board Secretary, and is currently serving as Wichita Pride's Volunteer Director. In 2019, Byers gave a speech on the steps of the Supreme Court of the United States on behalf of GLSEN, while the court was hearing arguments on Bostock versus Clayton County, which is the landmark United States Supreme Court civil rights case in which the court held that the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 protects employees against discrimination because they are gay or transgender. And in 2019, Byers sought the Democratic nomination for the Kansas State House of Representatives. She won the nomination and was elected in the general election, becoming not only the first transgender person elected to the Kansas legislature, but also the first transgender Native American elected to office. I am pleased to have our speaker today, State Representative Stephanie Byers. Representative Byers.
Good morning. And thank you all for having me here today. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be a part of this. One of the things that is interesting is, while you're on your lunch breaks and enjoying this thing, I'm wondering what I'm going to have for breakfast. Greetings from Kansas. We're out here in the middle of everywhere. But thank you for this opportunity to speak to you. I want to talk with you today about how we work with those whose gender is maybe perceived different than our own, and in ways that we can be affirming. Why is this important? Well, for one thing, for us who are transgender, there may be somebody out there that's made this a choice, but I have yet to meet anybody. For me, this is who I've always been. So a little bit of my background. I'm 58 years old, so that makes me a child of the 60s, an adolescent in the 70s, an adult in the 80s, and I became a parent in the 90s and lived my life with the secret of being transgender for most of that time. I did not come out publicly showing my authentic self until 2014. And so most people perceive me one way while I had this deep secret. Well, the reason why this is important is that's a pretty common experience for a lot of transgender people. And what I'm about to tell you comes from my own experience. So if you are transgender or if you know someone who is, please don't assume that we all have the same experience. You know, the saying is if you pulled 20 people at random and put them in a room and told them that they need to talk to each other, it would take them a while and they would eventually find commonalities and they could have conversations. If you pulled 20 trans people together into a room and told them they could talk about anything except for being trans, it would take them just about as long, because that one aspect of being transgender may be the only commonality we have, because there's so many other aspects to our lives. But it is something that interfaces with public in so many ways. When you are transgender, who you are before you begin to live authentically, you know, you experience things, you understand things, but you decide how much of who you are you're going to showcase to the rest of the world. And so that oftentimes leads to this idea of almost like this interior wall where you develop on one side of the wall and you put this avatar on the other side of the wall for the rest of the world to interact with, until you feel safe enough or you feel brave enough or whatever combination of things to be able to push through that wall and begin to live authentically. And so oftentimes we don't know that someone is trans when they know that they are. And so when we start talking about this, these are things that we apply not just to someone specifically that we know, but also to anyone in general, because we don't know the walk they've walked, especially with those of us that are in the service industry where someone walks into our office and we have an interaction with them for a few minutes. We don't know what baggage came in with them. We don't know their background. We don't know their history. We just know who we stand there in front of us. When we talk about gender identity, we're talking about a multiple of three different things. One, we can talk about their assigned sex at birth. For me, as I was a child, when I was born, the doctors told my parents, congratulations, you have a boy. That was my assigned sex at birth. My gender identity is who I've always known myself to be. That's inside my head. I know this is who I am. This is how I've always felt myself to be. This is who I truly at the core of my being am. My gender presentation is how I present myself to you so that you get the chance to see who I'm trying to express myself to be. And my gender reception is how you perceive me, that perception that you look at and you go, oh, I see a woman there, that's how I understand it. So all those things kind of come together, and that's how we perceive and work with gender. And sometimes with people who are transgender, that may be difficult because oftentimes we're trying to present who we are, but it may not necessarily be what you see or perceive. And so we have to make those grounds and figure those things out. And so one of the things that we do is in simple introductions. So if I were to be speaking to you in person, I would have started off with, hi, I'm Stephanie Byers. My pronouns are she and her. That way you know what my pronouns are. And if we were meeting one-on-one, I would pause at that point in time to give you a chance to introduce yourself to me. And hopefully, because I've given you my pronouns, you will in turn give me your pronouns. It's a way of inviting that in without saying, so what pronouns do you go by? Because sometimes that's frustrating, just to know that. And the reason why these become so important, in 2017, 2018, the University of Texas did this massive study over trans youth between 17 and 21 years of age. And what they found out was that those trans kids who got to use their real name, the name that they go by, they got to use their pronouns, they were 71% fewer symptoms of severe depression. They had 24% decrease in the reported thoughts of suicide, and the big thing is they had a 65% decrease in suicide attempts. So a simple thing like using someone's name that they tell you and using the pronouns that they want you to use, doing those things, you can actually save somebody's life. Just being that simple and that kind and that caring so that it comes forward with that. When we meet each other in these business systems, when we meet each other in an office setting, when we meet each other over a phone call, it's a simple matter of courtesy. Sometimes we go, but that's not the name that I see on the paperwork. When I was in high school, I went to school with a young man named Jerry. Most people did not know that Jerry was his name. because Jerry had gone through his entire life being called Junior. He was not the child of Jerry Sr. That someone just started calling him Junior, and so Junior stuck with him for his entire life. And we do that all the time. And when I was a high school band director, I had a young man that started as a freshman with me that was introduced to me by his parents as Bobby. And I called him Bobby. And then one day I'm looking at the roll sheet when we got school started, and I said, I'm confused, Bobby. I don't see you on my rolls. And he came over and looked at the sheet, and he pointed to the name Kenny. He said, that's me. I'm Kenny. I said, but your parents even call you Bobby. He says, well, that's because I look like the character Bobby from the cartoon King of the Hill. And so we do this every day in our lives. We adjust for those things. We make that happen. What we're asking for, and in the transgender setting, is that the person that when you talk to somebody, whatever name it says, it's okay to say, so what can I call you? You know, what is your name? And give them the opportunity to say, well, it says this, but I go by this. Even in my own family, I have a brother who, in his work setting, everybody knows him as Paul. In our family setting, everyone knows him as Kevin, because my father's name is Paul. So we always have called him Kevin to differentiate, and we understand how that works. So that's what we're doing. Sometimes people sit down and say, you know, I can understand these things, but I'm just curious, what is it that causes a person to be transgender? And truthfully, that's something that we don't know. Most medical professionals will tell you that they believe it to be a biological component, that there is something that happens to us as we're developing before we are born that helps to create these things that bring us together. And so far, you know, we've talked specifically just about people who are transgender. And for me, we're speaking more along the lines of what we call the binary, whether a person is male or female. So I am a trans woman, and there are other people that might be trans men, and there's always a space between them. They are not connected together. But there are also people that are more gender fluid, and so their identity may flex from time to time. There are people that believe they belong somewhere on the spectrum of gender in the middle. They don't really feel male, they don't really feel female, they're kind of somewhere in between. And there's all kinds of other ramifications that roll around with that so that someone can choose how they are. And we've seen this for a long time in our lives, but we may have had other names for it, and those people may have had similar things. It can be confusing. So you can have someone who is born female, identifies female, but dresses very masculine, which is fine. We're accepting of that. On the flip side of it, you might have someone who is born male and identifies as male, but may dress a little more on the feminine side. Those are just aspects of who we live and how we live our lives. So we've talked about these identities, but it's also important to note that these identities are not our sexuality. Our sexuality is something different. Who we are attracted to is a totally different world. And what we're talking about right now is just how we do those things. So what happens when someone walks into the office and their driver's license says Jonathan, but they tell you that their name is Joanna? What do? Well, you may have to record paperwork as Jonathan because that's a legal setting, legal name. But you can still talk with that person as Joanna and introduce yourself and have that conversation with her and work on those aspects of things like that. It's just simply being kind. It's being understanding and doing that. And even if you can't wrap your head around why someone would be transgender, it's still okay just to be kind, just to be nice, to make sure all those things come together and it keeps things working properly for them. In my experience, we're right now, 34 states across the United States had legislation introduced that attacks the trans community in one way or another. And so for a lot of trans people, this is a hard time. And the more kindness you can show to those people, the more easy it is for them to relax and for them to be able to work with you to do the things that need to be done. So those are kind of just some real simple and basic things that we look at and we talk about. You know, when I encounter somebody, I've rarely had anyone do any type of misgendering with me. I rarely have anyone that's been just outright rude to me. But those things do happen, and we want to make sure that when someone comes in, especially looking for services from the government of one way or another, or talking with you about their identity, that we do such in a way that makes them feel comfortable so that they can express themselves as needed the way they need to. So as we go through these things, and I realize I had planned on this taking a little bit longer than it has, but it seems like the more I talk about this, the easier it is. Maybe the best thing to do is we start opening up for questions, and I can answer those questions for you. I will tell you right now that because I'm an open book, you can ask me any question that you want, and if it is something that's considered impolite within the trans community, I might tell you it's impolite, but I'm going to go ahead and answer the question for you, because I believe this is about educating, about people wanting to know. As you can see from the slide up here, my wife and I run a company called Gender.Training, where this is what we do here in Kansas. We go into various businesses that invite us in, ask us, provide gender training. And we talk about this. We talk about how we can alter our forms to be more gender inclusive. We talk about how we can approach those and make things seem more welcoming when someone walks into an office. And, you know, me not knowing exactly what all you're experiencing across North Carolina, but I'm welcome to answer whatever questions that you might have. And so what questions do you have for me while I'm here? Throw them into the chat room.
Okay, I'll go ahead and get started with some questions for you. And I'd like to first start by saying that there are a lot of issues that affect the LGBTQ plus population more than others, because this group is at a higher risk of things like suicidal thoughts and mental health issues. How important is it for us to consider this when working to make our spaces and work culture more inclusive and welcoming? So in other words, how do we make it more trans-friendly to best accommodate trans staff?
Simple things. You know, like I said earlier, providing your own pronouns, and it seems like a kind of an odd thing to do, like on your business card, you have your name and then put your pronouns underneath that. But what that does is that sends out the message that you are aware that pronouns may not necessarily be what people anticipate, and so you provide yours, and it opens the door then for someone else to provide theirs. That's just, it's almost like a little subtle clue that you are more affirming. You know, if you have choices in your office setting of things that you can put out, if you have rainbow stickers, if you have a small space with you know, something that's trans affirming, a trans flag, something like that, just even if there's a small card or something on the wall, those type of things really make a difference. And so the clues are there, the cues are there, the person picks up on them, and that helps them to relax and know that they're in a place that's affirming. And, you know, it's important that we do those things because of the fact that that helps that interaction go much smoother, much easier. And like I said earlier, suicide rates are extremely high. They're 5 times higher among the trans community than they are among the community at large. And, you know, part of that is because of the emotional exhaustion of trying to be yourself. We sometimes call that transitioning, when a person who we perceive one way begins living another way. But honestly, that's just moved that person living authentically. When I started in 2014 to present myself as who I am, that was just showing everybody else who I've always known. The transition took place with all the people that I worked with. And honestly, it was an interesting thing because I taught at the largest high school in the state of Kansas, and someplace that I started working at in 1991, and I transitioned in 2014. I continued to work there for another 5 years. So it was a very public thing, you know, and it seemed that most everyone around us were very accepting, they easily transitioned to referring to me as Ms. Matter of fact, the story with my band of orchestra kids on the first day of school, that very first day they met the authentic me, was sitting down in the room and saying, obviously we need to talk about something. And it got really quiet, and I said, so here's what it is. You knew me as Mr. Byers, now it's Ms. Byers, and most of you just called me Byers. That still works. Now let's talk about what we're going to do with marching band. And that's how it all went forward. But those type of interactions, just to take the edge off a little bit, because there is that fear, you know, that you walk in presenting as your authentic self, but perhaps you haven't had a chance to get your driver's license changed. Perhaps your social security number and name are still different. And so just giving that opportunity to show someone that, hey, you tell me who you are, and that's how I will interact with you. That brings that down. Just having little things around the room that let somebody know. In my wife's office, she has a stuffed elephant that is pink, blue, and white. And so most people just look at it, it's a pink, blue, and white striped kids elephant. But for a trans person, they immediately notice that that's a trans flag. And that helps them understand, that you are somebody to be perceived as an ally.
Wendy, a couple of questions from the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and ask those. First question for you, Representative Byers, is, let me scroll back up to the first one. How would you recommend someone who is not educated on transgender issues to discuss it with their teenager who may have questions?
Wow, that's a really good question. On the page we have here on gender.training, if you go to that website, we also have a resources page, and there are several really good books that are there to kind of talk with trans youth to kind of open those doorways and be able to get that going through. There's this idea, and a lot of times we see nowadays, in my time, as I became a teenager in the 70s, it was very frustrating to try to express your gender identity because that was a different culture we lived in. But where we are at now in the United States, where there is more understanding and more acceptance going on, we see a lot of kids beginning to come out and express their gender earlier. And one of the reasons why is we understand usually like the 6th grade, 7th grade level, but it's when we start seeing a lot of kids begin to show their true gender. And somebody will sit down and say, well, why is it happening then? Well, what else is happening in human life about the time that you're 11, 12 years old? Puberty starts. And if you're a transgender, that's where it really intersects hard with you. And so you begin to try to show who you really are despite how your body is developing. And so that time frame there is a great time for kids who are beginning to express that, for parents to sit down and talk about that. If you go to that resources list, and can find those books that are there. You can also email me at stephanie@gender.training. I would be happy to provide you with a bibliography list of things that can help work that out to be able to make those discussions happen.
Thank you. Another question from the chat. What tips do you have when you find out a coworker is trans, but they may not have told you that themselves, so you hear it secondhand, or you see they have a different legal name? What tips do you have for someone for handling that type of situation?
Boy, have patience. It's up to each trans person to disclose who they are. Sometimes there's a reason not to tell someone. And so, it's just still be kind and be friendly. And when that person feels that you're a safe person to talk to, they'll open up to you and maybe explain it at some point in time. But that trans person, it's their job to control that narrative. And so, don't push into it. Just continue to treat them how they've asked you to treat them to begin with. And when the time is right, they'll be able to express themselves to you. And it's kind of like when we started this thing. If you know somebody who's trans, my experience won't be the same as theirs. So don't expect them to behave a certain way. Just wait for them to be there to be supportive. And they'll be able to open up with you when they feel safe about it.
Another question from the chat. We've got a lot of good ones coming in. One viewer says his church has posted restroom signs that says these restrooms are for those identifying as male. These are for those identifying as female. Is that enough? How could they possibly be more affirming?
Well, I think that's probably plenty right there to be able to have those signs there. But we have multiple ways of being affirming. One goes back to having that kindness and friendliness within the congregational setting. We can't force people to do, but oftentimes we have the corporate idea of this is affirming, so we put a sign on the bathroom. But the actual members of the congregation may be the ones that talk about each other, or they may, we see that a lot in churches anyway. But the fact that they say male identifying and female identifying is great. And, you know, there might be something there as well for those people who don't identify as male or female, or those who, you know, shift back and forth, to let them know that they're welcome to use either facility. You know, just make sure you wash your hands afterwards.
Absolutely. Let's see, I've got a couple of others here in the chat. People keep them rolling in. This is a very active chat today, so that's great. Any tips for handling employees who openly refuse to acknowledge an employee's request to be addressed with a new name or gender identity?
Well, and that's a tough one, because of the fact that, you know, if you're a supervisor and you have a policy, a state policy that says this is what you will do, then you have a way of coming back and saying, you have to abide by this policy. You know, if not, you know, you might let the person know that if they refuse to do that, maybe what they can do is just not use any pronoun or any name, just talk to the individual. The other options too, of course, is if there is someone else that does the same job who is affirming, see if you can get that individual into someone who is comfortable, because the main goal is providing services, not necessarily your own personal bias. You know, and I would also remind people that they work for the state. This is, you know, a job they have chosen, and they may be really good at it, but they have to abide by what the state policies are in these regards.
Thank you. A couple other questions. What tips do you have for acclimating employees to another employee who is introducing themselves as transgender? So perhaps they have a new name, new presentation, the way they present themselves with dress and things like that. How can you help acclimate other employees to that person?
You know, we do it all the time, but we don't always necessarily do it with gender. You know, so if we have someone who gets divorced and now we're having to refer to them by a new name, we do that. If we have someone who gets married, we make that transition and we change those things around like that. It kind of comes down to the same things. It's just a matter of saying, you know, firmly, you know, if the person has come out and said, this is who I am, this is who I want you to refer to me as at work, then everybody in the office should abide by that, you know. And if someone has questions, don't put it on the trans person to explain. You know, the trans person may have some resources that can help understand this, but, you know, kind of have some basic ideas of places you can go, you know. And in this day and age, it's easy to jump out on the internet and look something up and find those resources that kind of explain what to do. But, you know, it's still, everything comes back down around to being kind. I will tell you that the other thing that often happens is after transition for that person, when they begin living authentically, somebody from their past may slip off and refer to them by what's referred to as their dead name. You know, so my name before I was Stephanie would get used occasionally. My gender would get used, my previous gender would get used occasionally. I would get misgendered. You know, and when those things happen, just a simple, my bad, I'll do better. And don't make a big deal out of it, because that oftentimes makes it even worse when you get it wrong. But then also practice, so that when you are talking about that person and they're not around, you're still using their name that they now go by, you're still using the pronouns that they use, so that you begin to get those neural pathways aligned in your own brain to think of them in that way. You know, it really works pretty simple and pretty easy. And it's surprising too, oftentimes, that, you know, in my experience in the high school that I taught at for so long, when I transitioned, when I began living authentically, a lot of my colleagues that had known me for decades came to me and said, you know, this now makes sense to me. Who you are makes sense to me. Before I knew you, but there always seemed to be something not quite locked in. But now I know you, and it's like, you've always been Stephanie to me, and it makes sense. And that experience oftentimes is what accompanies for a lot of people when they have those opportunities to present themselves.
Another question. If there is someone who is not comfortable, perhaps, with someone who is transgender, is it considered rude to not refer to that person by their preferred pronouns, but rather just by their name?
I think it's fine to refer to someone just by their name. You know, because that's better than doing nothing, you know, and it's better than referring to them by their former name. And, you know, sometimes it takes people a little bit to adapt to those pronouns, but you need to make every effort, because what we're talking about, you know, for human beings, it's all about relationship, how we deal with each other, especially in a work setting. Those relationships are one of those ways that we build trust. The more trust we have with each other, the better we function together as a unit. And if we're having these arbitrary dividers put up between us, that makes it really, really hard. In a talk that I gave to a school, I had a young man approach me about his sibling who had changed genders and his frustration with it. And I said, you know, the thing about it is that as long as you keep thinking about your little sister, you're missing the opportunity of gaining a relationship with your brother, because that's who they are now. They're your brother. And if you want that relationship, you're going to have to try to figure out ways to bridge that gap to develop that way. And in a work setting, oftentimes we don't have those really close personal relationships, but we need to have those abilities to be able to make that work as best as possible. So a lot of times it just takes practice and getting used to it. But like I said, that means also thinking in those terms. You know, if it's somebody you've known for a while, make sure that you're thinking about them with the pronouns they now use. Make sure that you think of their name so that you're less likely to slip up and you're more likely to engage with them as who they are.
More questions from the chat. What strategies have you found to be successful with changing the minds of politicians who make policy, as many of them fail to legislate unless they are personally affected by an issue?
Oh, that's a really good one. Once again, it comes down to the relationship. You know, it's been, for Kansas, this my first session, it's been interesting because of the COVID pandemic we've been in. We've spent a lot of time in isolation, even within the State House. So we would come in and work from our offices instead of working in committee rooms. We didn't have big dinners among the legislators. So those interpersonal relationships didn't really start to develop until we reached a point with vaccinations that we were able to open up a little more fully and be able to have those social interactions a little bit. But it's also important to note, too, that as I started off, there can be trans people around you that no one knows are trans. These politicians that I deal with, their grandchildren can be trans and they don't know it. You know, their siblings can be trans and they don't know it because it hasn't been safe for that person to express who they really are. And so trying to get them to see that in a sympathetic light, that they understand that there is the possibility that they already do know somebody. You know, one of the things that I told the House of Representatives when we were considering some anti-trans legislation that's coming through is that, you know, there are 125 members of the Kansas House, and so now there are 125 people that can no longer say they don't know someone who's trans because they know me. And, you know, that begins to have that impact. And unfortunately, with politics, we also understand, too, that there is the interpersonal level, but there's also the political level. So we had people that voted for banning trans girls from sports who came to me later and apologized and said that the only reason why they did is because that's what their party believes in. They personally don't think that way and wanted to make sure that I was confident that the governor was going to veto the bill. You know, so we understand those things. We need to make sure that we just try to, you know, let people know that the person that you love might be the very person this is going to impact, and you just don't know it yet.
How should someone deal with negative chatter or comments from coworkers after maybe a transgender customer has left the office?
You know, talk to them about gossip and why is that important. You know, if we're treating everybody with dignity and respect, then we need to make sure that we apply that everywhere. And, you know, it can be catty, you know, those things happen. But it's important that we always remember that people are who they are. And most of the time, the circumstances that have made them who they are not things they had control of. And although a lot of people would probably disagree with this, but it's fewer and fewer all the time, for trans people, it wasn't a choice. No one woke up one day and said, I'm going to walk this horrible walk, have people that are angry with me all the time, have people that tell me that I'm lying if I tell them who I really am, have people that are looking to try to erase my identity, but this is who I am. You know, no one's going to step into that discriminatory world intentionally. It's just a matter of making sure that we're there to be supportive. And, you know, it's okay to tell someone, say, why are you talking like that? You know, why did you find that important to say that? You know, because it isn't important. It's just gossip. And they may not know. It's been a surprise to me, by me coming out living authentically, the number of people that have come to me that from my past that I have known, who then begin to tell me about their transgender sibling, their transgender brother-in-law who is now their kid's aunt, their transgender father that they refer to by another name. And there are a lot of people that know someone who is transgender, and when you begin that little gossipy thing in the office, you don't realize that you're talking about someone that someone else may love, that someone else is more important in their life. And so it's just reminding them that it's gossip, and just let it drop and move on.
Really interesting question. You talked about human interaction, relationships, and things like that. Without any human interaction, when you're entering a new environment, what would make someone who identifies as transgender feel safe in that space, safe or welcomed in that space without human interaction?
The decor, you know, to start with. I see
Sorry, I thought I could hear the dog in the background.
That's okay. I'll wait for my dog to see if he'll bark back. But you know, just the things that you have in the office. If you have a copy of the local Pride guide sitting out on the desk, if you have something that just shows that there is some acceptance in that room, we have a flag here in Wichita that is our city flag. Is red and white with a blue center, and it's kind of a very attractive flag. I have a version that flies on my house that's done in Pride colors. It's the same pattern, you know, and I have a little bitty one that sits on my desk at the Capitol building. It's just there. And for someone who is tuned into this, who's transgender, they're going to pick up on those cues and know that they're welcome there, you know, and just, you know, little knickknacks and things that we can put out that showcase that we're accepting. The other thing I would suggest too, any type of form that you use, where it gives an option for salutations or for sex, make sure that there's at least one blank there where that person can describe how they refer to themselves. You know, so you can have legal name, and then down below, you know, chosen name or name of usage. You know, something that lets somebody put down not just their legal name, but also the name that they go by. And you know, and that works pretty much for all people who are not trans. Well, like I said earlier, we have a lot of people that have a nickname that actually are more comfortable with than their given name. But, you know, doing those things, and also making sure that if it says male, female, and then have another box that says or as you use, you know, something so that can be, you know, put down there.
Interesting question here is regarding the pronoun they. How do you integrate that pronoun into business communications without confusion, such as tense and syntax and things like that? Would it be best to just refer to that person by name, perhaps, in that circumstance, or how do you integrate that in business communications?
Well, first of all, we need to talk about the fact that we use they in common usage all the time, and often are unaware that we do. You know, for instance, you're sitting around watching television. The doorbell rings, and you say, "Hey, pizza's here. Somebody go pay them." You don't. There's not 3 people delivering pizza to your door. There's not 2 people. There's one person standing there that brought the pizza. But you say pay them because that's what we do. We can't say pay the guy or pay the girl. We just say pay them. and that's there. So we do this all the time. And I think that in usage in business communications properly, it is completely acceptable to use they in that communicative stance. And I think that as our syntax and language evolves, we're able to do that more efficiently and easily. It's not a new thing. It's been around the English language for quite, for a couple of centuries where they has been used. But I would also sit down and say that if you're really wrestling with it, then just use their name and do that. And understand that it might be redundant. You might sit there and go, I've used their name twice now, and you'll find yourself saying they instead. To make it a little bit easier, but it is possible to do it.
If you're onboarding a new employee who's transgender and their name perhaps is not aligned with the documents, what are some ways to be more welcoming or accepting? I know you talked about having spaces to fill out, maybe what the preferred name was and stuff like that.
Well, that's one thing to do. Is just say preferred name, but also. It's okay to sit down and say, and probably they'll tell you anyway, that, I know my document says that I'm Peter Andrews, but I'm actually going to go by, Nancy. And you go, okay, Nancy, it was nice to meet you. And then, some way of making sure that and you can explain to other people. In most cases, there's only one or two people that actually know the legal name on the documentation. It really comes down to how someone introduces themselves. And when it comes to like printing up name badges and things like that, have that flexibility to print the name on there that the person goes by, and so that opens up that doorway so that you can be able to do that efficiently and easily. And you know what? Chances are you already do this anyway, because somebody who's got James Mitchell III but goes by Jimmy, his name badge might say Jimmy. And you just go along with it. It's just doing the same thing, but you're going to do it with a name that may go across the gender line for how you think.
So we talked about some of the obstacles that transgender employees might face, some of the more common ones. What are some of the lesser known, uncommon obstacles that may be faced in the workplace?
Well, in the case of like trans men, going into a men's restroom but needing to use feminine products because of their anatomy. And having a place to dispose of them properly. There's that type of thing. It's simple things like that. And oftentimes it seems like so much of it revolves around restroom usage, but it's just doing those type of things. And being inclusive in some ways, when we had a Women of the Legislature luncheon, I was honored that they made sure that I was invited as well. And, because I didn't know how it was going to play out, and nobody on either side of the political aisle batted an eye that I was supposed to be there, and they were fine with that. But, those are the type of things that we look at. And just understanding those things, that it's a matter of doing that. And also, sometimes too, it's making sure that people understand what is considered professional attire for the office, and what is acceptable and what is not, and making those allowances anyway. In the Kansas legislature and the House of Representatives, if a man goes to the well to speak, he is required to wear a coat. But if women go to the well to speak, they are not, because it's not considered a part of women's dress. And so it's just making sure that everybody understands what the rules are that are not necessarily written down, but those type of things.
Let's see, a couple other questions on here. Let me scroll back. We've had a lot, so I'm playing a little bit of catch up here. Let's see. How can we adjust office restrooms so that both transgender and non-transgender people can be comfortable using them at the same time? So an example that's given is thinking of non-transgender women who have had a sexually traumatic experience, potentially being scared to share a bathroom with someone who was assigned male at birth. How do we kind of combat that issue?
I would think that for the folks that are intimidated about the possibility that there may be somebody in that restroom, that for that individual, if there is a single occupant restroom somewhere in the building, make sure that they know that it's available, so that way they can avoid that by being able to go to a restroom by themselves somewhere. And I realized that we, as a school teacher, I always knew where those single occupant restrooms were because they're all over the building for different uses and different reasons. At the Kansas State Capitol building, we have one in the entire building, and it's down in our lowest level, and it's buried way back off in a corner. But for someone who is thinking that they may run into somebody who is transgender, who possesses anatomy that's different than what they expect, then for that individual that has that fear to say, hey, listen, I know that this might be uncomfortable for you, so here's where the single-use facility is for you, so that way you don't have to worry about the possibility. And truthfully, you don't know, and especially in a setting like a government setting, the people are coming in from the public, it's always an option. And so, you don't know where they're going to be and how they're going to be. So giving that as a manner of privacy for those people that be uncomfortable, I think would be the preferred way to do it.
How should management handle issues where there may be gossip? We touched on this a little bit earlier, but how should management handle those issues where there may be gossip or negative comments being made about a transgender employee?
That transgender employee is a team member. They were hired for a reason, and to make sure that whatever the mission statement is or whatever the underlying philosophy is that drives that department or that business, that manager reminds those employees of what the focus is. That, this is business, this is a job. And it's great when those jobs develop those interpersonal relationships that we call friendships. That's wonderful. But at the same time, it's important to note that that person, that transgender employee, is a person of value, and we want to keep them there. And so as such, those people need to curb the gossip. They need to bring it down, and it would be no different than anything else. If a parent is struggling because they have a college-age child who's now gone into drug rehab, how much gossip is going to be allowed about that child who's trying to be able to bring themselves out into something better? Those type of things that happen as we go through. Someone who has cancer, has gone through chemo, has lost all their hair, they're now wearing a wig. Are you going to allow the gossip going on about that person? Or are you going to make sure they understand that this is a person that we're going to treat with dignity because they're walking this walk and we're going to walk with them? Just kind of keeping it back on what's the focus of the organization and making sure that people understand that that's where they need to make sure they put their focus on while they're on the job.
Fantastic, thank you.
Very, very busy. Do you have advice on what hiring managers should and should not say and do when interviewing or considering a trans candidate, considering hiring a trans candidate?
Well, I think that the things to note, with trans candidates, oftentimes that paper trail is going to go back through the experience, and there might be a change of name somewhere along the lines with that. And, are you hiring the name, or are you hiring the qualifications? And think about those things when you're talking with them. Also, just be respectful and, like I said, open the door and, introduce yourself and throw your pronouns in when you introduce yourself, so that way that gives them a chance to say who they are and their pronoun usage. And more than likely, if you are patient and wait, they will bring up what they've anticipated as being issues and give you a chance to kind of talk through those things. But, just treat them the same way you would with anybody else. Because being a trans person is just who they are. It's not necessarily what they do. And, can they do the job you're looking for? If you're hiring someone for IT, can they do the IT job? If you're hiring someone to be a mid-level manager working with the public, is that someone that all these things that you can do, it's no different because they're transgender than it would be with anybody else. So it's just a matter of keeping things open and polite and kind, and working with them along those lines. But just making sure that goes down. Sometimes people talk about the appearance of someone who is transgender. I can tell you that if you go out to any park this time of year and just sit down on the bench and watch people walk by, you will see people that look different all over the place. And we're accepting of them forever. And it's just applying those same principles and ideas that we do with those people who are transgender. You know, are they meeting the standard of dress required for the office? Are they doing the things that they're required to do? You know, and that standard of dress is not gendered. You know, if there is a certain dress for people who are women, if someone who is female identifying, they meet that standard. You know, those are the things that we're talking about, but it's just giving them the opportunity to be themselves.
And Representative Bias, should we be more optimistic about the future of trans employees in the workplace because there is more awareness of the issues now?
I hope so, and I believe so. You know, we see change happening, especially at the federal level, and it's working its way through. But we're also seeing pushback coming through at the state level. But as a country, more and more we are more accepting. Whether this has any merit to the discussion overall, I can talk to you from my own experience. You know, here I am in the middle of very conservative Kansas, and running as an openly trans person when I ran for office, and I did not win my election by a little bit. I won my election by a margin of 55.4% to 44.6%. And so, you know, having that 11% win there is a statement that here in my district that the fact that I was transgender was not so important. What was important was, you know, how I thought about Medicaid expansion, how I thought about funding public education, how I thought about working with our unemployment system to try to shore up some of the issues we were having with that. Those were the areas that we're looking at. And I think that more and more people are beginning to see that. And we're seeing more trans representation all over the place. And the pushback we're seeing is really from small groups. They're very loud, but they don't represent the majority of people. And so even when we look at polling regarding these issues, we find that even among conservative people, you know, 70% don't want to see laws that discriminate against trans people. So we are at that point, and it's going to keep working that way. But like any type of change we've seen as we've gone through our civil rights from the 50s until now, every time we make advances, there is pushback that comes back, and then we make more advances and a little more pushback. Will we get everybody there? Probably not, because there's always going to be somebody who feels like that they've got to other people some way, that those people are other than us, those people are different than us. But we'll get most people, and I think we're already on that pathway.
I have this question from the chat from someone that says, I'm personally struggling with the pronoun thing in terms of identifying myself. I basically identify as male, but I don't have a strong desire to label myself as such. Is it okay to not identify if doing so makes me uncomfortable? Or in this case, should I use they, them if I don't have a strong desire to label myself as one or the other?
You know, you be you. And if you feel like they, them works for you because you don't feel strongly one way or another, that's fine. My favorite statement that I've heard lately is someone said, my pronouns are she, her, and hun. And of course, this person from the South. And you know, I kind of like that. You can call me hun. I wouldn't mind that at all. I know people that their pronouns are he, she, they. You know, because to them pronouns are unimportant. They're a social construct, and so they'll go by anything. Some of my Hispanic friends use the pronoun ella, E-L-L-A. You know, it's just up to you as to how you want to define yourself. And so if you identify male but you don't feel so strongly about it, it's okay just to say they, you know, and use that as your pronoun. That would be fine. And I really appreciate the trans flag being the background of the question slide here.
Oh, well, no problem with that. We wanted to have something specific toward this event, but this is also inclusive of just LGBTQ Pride Month. We wanted to look a little more at the transgender spectrum of things, and I'm just so glad that you're here. I do have another question, and we do have a lot of questions coming in from the chat. Probably this has been one of our more active chat sessions, so again, thank you for answering all of these questions. Can you comment on the increased representation of trans individuals in the media, political arena, entertainment? Because as of this week in the NFL, Carl Nassib came out as gay as an active player within the NFL. So can you comment on the increased representation of trans individuals in the media or LGBTQ individuals in the media?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we're going to probably see more and more of it because as acceptance comes around, you know, we look at the history and we know looking backwards that we've seen LGBT people involved in the media for decades, for, you know, over a century. We just didn't know it because it wasn't until maybe the end of their lives that they were able to become forward and be public about who they really were. But now that we're living in a time where people are more accepting of this, we see more and more of these things happening. And, you know, it's unfortunate that some of the early people that came out, especially in professional athletics, their careers ended very quickly. We didn't get to see them long. With Nassib, we got to see, you know, him play for 5 years before being able to, so he was able to establish himself, and now we see them as a gay player. But, you know, those things are there. In the media, we're seeing more and more of that. We're seeing more trans people especially being able to come up because we've almost gotten to the point where we accept the fact that there will be gay actors, there will be lesbian actors, but seeing a trans actor now, we're beginning to understand that a little bit better and seeing those folks come on through. On politics side of things, you know, in 2017, Danica Roem became the first trans legislator elected elected in the United States as a delegate in West Virginia. And what we see now, or in Virginia, what we see now are there are 8 of us that are out trans that are serving state legislatures from Delaware and New Hampshire and Connecticut and Colorado here in Kansas, as well as Danica is still serving in office. You know, we're probably fairly soon we'll begin to see trans men serving in state legislatures as well. When we look at Generation Z, you know, the youngest of our folks right now, we know that recent surveys show that 1 out of every 5 members of that generation identify as somewhere in the LGBT spectrum. And so, you know, we're going to see more and more of this. It's not that there's an increase. It's probably 1 in 5. You know, I was born in '63, so I'm the last of the baby boomers. You know, there's probably 20% of us that would identify as LGBT, but it wasn't always safe to do so. So we figured out how we could deal with that in ways. So it looks like this percentage of people that are LGBTQ just keeps getting bigger and bigger with each generation, but it's probably pretty close to the same. It's just that now we're more accepting and more open to be able to express those things. More questions?
Now, many employers, they admit to feeling anxiety about their lack of knowledge and understanding. It's the biggest issue that simply that employees and employers are unprepared, or would more diversity, equity, and inclusion training be the easy answer to address this, or is that just a good start?
You know, diversity, equity, and inclusion training is a good start. And again, educating people is helpful because that gets it, but it still comes down to how you interact with someone. It's the way to move things forward. And the thing is that except for the person's transgender status, they're a person just like anybody else. When we think back about maybe the discomfort historically we've experienced when we've had someone of a different ethnicity begin working in an office compared to everybody else, or we've had people to come in whose religious beliefs are different than ours. We make those acclamations. We get used to that, and then we move forward with it, and then it becomes just they're just somebody else as a part of the office. And so with that diversity, equity, and inclusion training, we begin to gain those understandings of how to interact with that. And as we have people that come in from that diversity, then it gives us opportunities to practice those things. And as the nation become more and more used to it, with trans folks, we're everywhere, and there's more of us than people realize. There's more of us than what we realize. We know that all the different studies that have been done are people volunteering their status as trans. There's nobody that actually can identify you one way or another. And so the assumption is that the percentage, which right now they say is like between 0.3 and 0.6% of the population, is actually much higher than that. We talk about here in Wichita, a city of 400,000 people, how many trans people would be that 0.6% number, and yet when those of us that are part of the trans community get together and talk, we start naming people off. We know a lot more people than that 0.6 number, and so we know that the number's not right. But it's just getting used to it and working on practicing and just engaging with folks, and we find those diversities and we love those diversities, and so it's just it's a way we can strengthen who we are.
Now, many people, they change jobs to avoid discrimination and rejection, and others hide their identity in interview applications. And unemployment is high among this group as well. How do we get ahead of those negative outcomes, beginning with onboarding? I know that's a constant theme, but how do we get ahead of those things?
That's a tough one. I mean, it's trying to make someone feel at home, trying to make someone feel comfortable in their own, that they're accepted for who they are when they're in that workplace. I know that once you have a good employee, the last thing you want to do is watch them leave and go someplace else. And sometimes it's a matter of maybe when someone comes to you and says, "Hey, I'm giving you my notice," doing an exit interview to find out, ask some questions about what was going on, especially if they're part of the LGBTQ community, because we understand microaggression happens, and it happens in all kinds of small ways, and sometimes that makes someone feel so uncomfortable they feel like they need to go someplace else. But it's just, as you talk through somebody, if you're bringing somebody on board and they've got the qualities that you want to keep around for a long time, start that open door dialogue at that point in time. Say, hey, listen, I really want to see you here. So if you're struggling with any difficulties, whatever, please come and talk to me about it. Because if we can do something about it before it becomes an issue that makes you feel like you need to go seek a job someplace else, we'd really like for you to stay with us. And opening those doors so those conversations take place, so that those things can be aired and plans can be put in place to help make those changes. And oftentimes the employee, can have those things as well. When I first began living authentically, I had one teacher in my building that struggled a little bit and would misgender me on a regular basis. But, I went and I talked with my principal about it. My principal and I sat down and talked with the teacher about it, and we, worked out, and it was not intentional. And this person now is one of my good friends. It was just, just one of those things where they weren't practicing thinking about who I was, you know, outside until we would just run into each other. So oftentimes we get things wrong. But it's just an easy thing, you know, to sit there and make those conversations and open the door so that you're looking at improving the working conditions while everything is going on.
Thank you. Now, a lot of times we use the term LGBTQ plus, and I've heard it referred to as the alphabet soup. But I have a question about non-binary. Can you give us a clear description of what non-binary means?
Well, pretty simply put, where you have, you know, male at one side and you have female at the other side of the spectrum, non-binary can be any place in between. And, you know, so somebody who doesn't see themselves as male, they don't see themselves as female, they're just kind of somewhere in between there, because this is how they identify. This is how they know themselves to be. Has nothing to do with what their physical makeup is, but it has everything to do with, you know, getting that context put in there. So they do that. So, you know, and oftentimes that's why we see someone who calls themselves they, because it's in here somewhere, not here or here, you know, on one side or the other. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about somebody who is non-binary. And non-binary could be that they truly do not identify as male or female. It could also be that some days they feel more male, some days they feel more female, and usually we use those terms, the term of gender fluid, at that point in time. They kind of slide back and forth. You know, it's for someone who experiences it, it makes complete sense. For somebody who doesn't experience that, they've always seen themselves as male, they were identified male at birth, and that's always who they've been, or someone who's always seen themselves as female, they identified female at birth, and that's always who they've been. If somebody's a little harder to understand how that might flex back and forth through there, but it's just another way of looking at it. Instead of thinking about two poles, we begin to think about the fact that it is a spectrum, it's a line between the two. And, you know, we live on one line or the other, or we live somewhere in between.
Now, Representative Byer, because you do serve on the state level, I have a question for you about legislation. How can we convince our local legislature to provide trans-affirming health care as a part of insurance coverage? Biden's recent executive order made it illegal to discriminate on gender identity in public services, and yet no trans government employees in North Carolina has health care coverage for the services that they need.
I think one of the things we need to work on in healthcare nationwide, and also with our medical providers, is the understanding of treating the body and not the gender. And I think that's one thing we need to talk about, because if we're talking about like maintenance style healthcare, if you are a trans man, you may still possess ovaries, you may still, you know, possess your uterus, you still need to be, you know, have your pap smears done. But it's understanding that even though your documentation, everything says male, and your name and identity with the insurance company says male, those are things that need to be covered, because that's still a part of your body. It's part of who you are. For a trans woman, you know, if you're over 50 and you need to have your prostate examined, that's just a part of it. And so it comes down to, that's a part of the body, and how are we going to deal with that? When we deal with the affirmation side of things, as someone who worked for our school district as a self-funded insurance system, when I was working here, when my documentation said male, I had to pay for all of my estrogen and things out of my own pocket. When my insurance documentation shifted to female, all of a sudden it was covered. You know, it's needing to understand those things on a broader scale, and it's getting better. There are insurance companies, national companies, Blue Cross is one of them, and I can't remember, maybe Coventry might be another one, that have written into their policies on how to deal with these things. But when we're talking about, great organizations that, that basically are self-funded on their insurance, but then they negotiate with one of these providers to take care of the insurance needs, we need to make sure that those committees that do this understand how to present that in such a way that we're looking at treating bodies and not necessarily treating the gender that shows up on documentation.
Now, what advice would you give to someone who is transgender but not out in the workplace? What would you say to them about taking the risk to come out and be their authentic self? Because it is a risk that they're taking, and they're going to have a lot to lose, in their opinion, sometimes. So can you talk about what it was like for you to take that initial first step?
Well, this is my story. And so I grew up in Oklahoma, and to parents who are beautiful, wonderful, loving folks. They're very accepting of me now. But my perception of them as a child growing up is that my parents were politically liberal but socially conservative, and I didn't feel like it was safe to even, tell my folks about myself. That I was afraid that I would lose my parents and that I would lose my younger siblings. I'm the oldest of 5. I have 4 younger brothers. That they would walk away and turn their backs on me. And so that fear really, it's almost insurmountable at times. Not to mention the fear of the greater public, because trans folks are subject to higher incidences of violence, especially if it's a trans person of color, especially if it's a trans woman of color. Those incidents of violence are very real, and we see them everywhere. So it can be a very frightening thing to step out and do. But there are people that have lived this way. For me, the being authentic on the inside but not interacting with people as my real self, that the emotional exhaustion of that was consuming. And I reached a point where I made that decision that I had to step forward. And each trans person comes to their own place with this, but it really comes down to deciding how you're going to, for lack of a better term, how you're going to die. Because that frustration of being who you are on the inside but not connected outside with everybody, that can lead to thinking that jumping off the planet is the best thing for me and you'll die quickly. The flip side of it is keeping it inside and keep going on, and it feels like a piece of your soul's dying off every day. And you may live a very long life, but who you are has remained hidden and not had the joys of interacting with people. For me, then, choosing to live authentically, to be myself, gave me the opportunity to enjoy my life, to connect with people as who I really am. One of the most frightening aspects of it is I have 2 sons. So sitting down and talking with my 2 grown sons about this, and the relief I had when my oldest looked at me and said, we know you raised us, and we're a little embarrassed you thought we might have a problem with this. We're going to love you, and we love you anyway. And, we want to see you be happy. We want to see you be you. And then in the work setting, when I began living authentically in 2014 in a public school setting, I was covered by those decisions that have been made in the Department of Education under the Obama administration. And even though here in Kansas, our conservative government here in the state had done away with due process for teachers, I was afraid that I might lose my job. And I did some checking. I, had the hypothetical, what if a teacher transitioned? How would the district react? And got affirmation back that the district would figure out how to work through it because we didn't have a plan in place at that time. I ended up with people talking to our district lawyers and with school board members, and before I ever let anybody know who I was, let alone began living authentically, I already knew that my district had worked out a way to be affirming on this. And so I was able to make those steps courageously because I knew that I had that support. And, so sometimes it's a matter of asking those questions and finding out, do you have that support? And, also as an entity, does your office, do they tell people out front, we will support the LGBTQ community. We're here. Will we make that pathway? When I talked with the Wichita Schools Equal Employment Officer as myself, and he said, so how can we help you transition? What do we need to do? We're here with you. That was one of the most affirming things anybody could possibly say, because it gave me the opportunity to be myself and to let me know that they would back that. But I would highly recommend to whoever that if they are safe to live their authentic lives, do so as early as they possibly can so that they can actually enjoy. Is it going to be, trouble-free? Probably not. Human life is not. We have things that come up all the time. But it does bring that richness where you do get that opportunity to interact with everybody as who you really are, and not just this avatar that's out there on the other side of your wall that's interacting with people on your behalf.
Okay, Representative Byers, I have my last couple of questions, and they've been coming in very seriously. What advice, what support is provided within the LGBTQ community to brown and black LGBTQ people? There has been a bit of controversy regarding those colors being added to the flag. It's my understanding that it was added due to the additional discrimination brown and black LGBTQ people experience within the community.
Well, flags are a personal design, and the fact that we are seeing more inclusion is a great thing. I don't think that when the original flag, when Gilbert Baker designed the original flag, that it was their intent to exclude. Matter of fact, we know that the original rainbow flag had more colors on it than what we currently see. But the cost of some of the fabrics to make that began to be exclusive, so they brought it down to fewer colors. But as we add more and more to it, I think it's important. As far as support goes, the support side of things oftentimes are community organizations, and we need to do a better job of reaching out to those that are different, even within the LGBTQ community, so that we are inclusive of everyone. It's sometimes frustrating. For me, as a Native American, this is my experience. My identity documents are changed absolutely everywhere except with my tribe. My tribe has no way of changing my identity documents to reflect who I truly am. And in order for me to do that, there's a lengthy, drawn-out process that basically means resigning from the tribe and then replicating my documents using a new birth certificate that also becomes a new thing from Oklahoma, to go back through the federal government to get a new certificate of degree of Indian blood, to reapply for tribal status as my new gender. And so there's not really that support there within my own tribe, but it's a matter of finding those places where we can lift each other up and do that. And it's hard because the fact that we've lived in a nation where so many have actively worked to divide us in every which way you can possibly imagine, whether it's by our religions or by our ethnicity, by our races, or by our status as members of the LGBTQ community. And so we have to not only work against the overall culture sometimes, but even within our own worlds to be able to make those doors open. But the support for people of color who are a part of the LGBTQ community, we really need to see that because that is where we're seeing the most discrimination. And we want to try to make sure that we bring that around so we can make changes for everybody, but especially those people who are at the farthest side of the marginalized communities.
Next to last question. How can organizations move beyond performative allyship and actually provide meaningful and sustainable systemic changes in the workplace to support transgender employees?
Hey, that's a really good question, especially this month, because we see a lot of performative allyship taking place right now. It's Pride Month, and because it's become a thing in the United States for us to really celebrate Pride, we see people that wouldn't otherwise do so, stepping up and flying rainbow flags outside of their businesses. We need to find ways where this is not just in June or just in October when we have the LGBTQ History Month. This needs to be something that we see year-long. It needs to be integrated into the documents that we write. When we see an affirmation statement, we need to put it in there. We need to make sure that we see those statements of non-discrimination, that it specifically includes sexual orientation and gender identity. We need to find ways to get the Senate to actually do something with the Equality Act. We need to do those things so that we can begin to move as a country more into that embracing of everyone, so that our diversity is a strength of what we got. There's been a lot of talk over the last couple of decades about American exceptionalism, but one of the things that makes America exceptional is the fact that we do have such diversity. In my parents' generation, people would talk about it being a melting pot. And as far as I'm concerned, what we need to be looking at is we need to look at the fact that the U.S. is a giant salad, and we each add a little part to the salad. It makes it delicious, and it makes it something that's even healthy and good for all of us. They don't always blend in together, but they are all individual pieces that make something better. And I think that's where we need to really be putting our focus. But to make it sustainable, it's going to take time. We're at this weird place where I think that the everyday person is much more accepting of everyone on the LGBTQ spectrum than what we see when we begin getting into groups. We see people begin to feed on each other and create ideas that may not necessarily be based on fact because of the grouping things. So the more we put this stuff down into policy, the more we put it down into law. Here in Kansas, we have the Kansas Act Against Discrimination. That's our overseeing bill for discrimination across the entire state. But it does not include gender identity. It does not include sexual orientation. And so for us, we need to make sure we've got that changed on our end so that that protection does explicitly become a part of law and not just a policy decision. Right now we see that the offices that interact with the Department of Justice at the federal level are being told that the decision of Bossight versus Clayton County should be expanded to everything, so that we do see that, sexual orientation and gender identity, that those are protected classes on the basis of sex in everything we do. But that's a policy decision. We need things to make sure that that goes into law so that it takes more steps to overturn that, so those protections become explicit, and that we see that across the board for everywhere we are at.
Representative Byer, one last question. What has been your greatest obstacle to overcome? And can you give us, as state government employees, some final thoughts or takeaways?
Wow, greatest obstacle to overcome. On a personal level, I think the biggest thing for me to overcome is my fear. My fear of what would happen, the what if, of when I began living authentically. I am someone who, because of whatever reasons, the challenges that I face since I began living authentically have been really pretty minimal. But I also realize that other people in my community, that's not the case, and that they've had those challenges there. So, I kind of feel like I've got a responsibility to reach out and lift up anybody around me that's trying to walk the same walk that I have, to try to help them get through the challenges that they face. As state employees, it comes back down to those interpersonal relationships, being kind, and being willing to listen to someone, and to not make those snap judgments, but to understand that we are who we are, treat everyone with respect. You know, sometimes we say that I'll give you respect if you give me respect. Well, how does that ever get started? You know, if I'm waiting for you to give me respect before I respect you, how about I respect you until you prove to me otherwise, that I shouldn't give you my respect, you know, and so open the door so I will respect you. And that way we begin to move that ahead so that we can build those relationships, you know, and to keep working on those things. You know, when someone comes in, you know, they're somebody's child, they were somebody's possibly sibling, they're somebody's possible spouse, you know, and just realize that, you know, they're a human being just like you, and to honor them and how you can, and how you deal with them, and so that respect is something that they will truly cherish.
Again, Representative Byers, I cannot express to you enough our thanks on behalf of the Office of State Human Resources for you to be able to come to speak to us so candidly today. I really have appreciated all of your insight that you've given us throughout this session today. And I've pulled up the screen again to show your information so that anyone that is interested in getting in contact with you, they can send you an email, because we still had several questions that were coming in that we're not going to be able to get around to answering. And we do apologize, but we have to maximize the amount of time that we do have. And again, I would like to say thank you, and thank you for coming to be our presenter today in celebration of LGBTQ Pride Month. And one of the main things that you said today is something that I want everyone to keep in mind as we look at how we regard each other as employees, and that's that kindness trumps any lack of knowledge. So again, just be kind and treat everyone with dignity and respect, because that's what everyone as an employee of the state of North Carolina deserves. At this time, we're going to conclude our presentation. I will tell you that it will be available on demand, and there will be closed captioning included as well. Thank you again for your time, and thank you, Representative Byers.
Thank you. Thank you.